How does the trade in human beings prepare the ground for the trade in land? And why did the great Christian empires, so vocal about saving souls, build their fortunes on the commerce of human bodies? For centuries, Africa was not a place to be conquered, but a coastline to be plundered, a fringe of fear and opportunity. European ships, ghost-like on the horizon, were not yet carriers of flags and governors, but of shackles and ledgers. They anchored off shores that would one day be named Ghana, Nigeria, Angola, but were then known only by their most profitable exports, the Gold Coast, the Ivory Coast, and most insidiously, the Slave Coast. This was the overture to the Great Colonial Symphony, a long, brutal rhythm of capture and sale that taught Europe one crucial lesson. Africa was a resource, its people a commodity. The forts that studded this coast, Elmina, Cape Coast, Gorée, were not embassies of culture. They were factories of death, stone and mortar warehouses for human cargo, holding pens where lives were stripped of names, families, and futures before being packed into the suffocating darkness of a ship's hold. The numbers are a fog of horror, but they whisper of 12, perhaps 15 million souls stolen, a demographic wound from which parts of the continent would never recover. The machine was diabolically self-sustaining. European guns sold to coastal kings fueled wars deeper in the interior. These wars were not fought for territory or honor, but for the one prize the white men on the coast desired above all else: captives. Entire societies were re-engineered around the slave trade, turning neighbors into predators and villages into hunting grounds. This calculated chaos, this bleeding of the continent's strength for 300 years, did more than enrich Liverpool, Lisbon, and Amsterdam. It created a perception. In the European mind, Africa became a place of endemic violence and backwardness, a place that needed to be saved from itself. The dehumanization required to chain a person and sell them was the same dehumanization that would later be required to justify stealing their land in the name of progress. Before Europe took Africa's land, it first had to unpeople it in its own imagination. The clinking of coins in the counting houses of London was the echo of the chains clanking in the barracoons of Dahomey. The first act of colonization was not military but economic and psychological. It was a long, slow poisoning that left the continent weakened, divided, and tragically vulnerable to the storm that was gathering just over the horizon, a storm carried not by slavers, but by men who claimed to come in the name of God, science, and civilization. Imagine waking up one morning to find your home, your city, and your country divided by a line on a map drawn by someone thousands of miles away. What would you feel? This gradual erosion of sovereignty, this normalization of exploitation, set the stage for a new and even more rapacious era. The age of abolition, when it finally dawned, did not bring freedom. It simply changed the business model. The slavers' maps, their knowledge of coastlines and local politics, the vast fortunes they had accumulated, all of it became the seed capital for the next greater venture. The men who would plunge into the heart of the continent, the so-called explorers, would follow paths first blazed by the pursuit of human prey. The world was changing. The Industrial Revolution demanded not just labor, but raw materials in colossal quantities: rubber, oil, cotton, minerals. And the old coastal trade, vile as it was, seemed inefficient, small-scale. Why buy from the middleman when you could own the entire factory? The lure of the unknown interior, a place cartographers filled with fanciful beasts and the words, "Here be dragons," was replaced by a more tantalizing legend, "Here be riches." The diaries and charts of sea captains and slave traders became treasured intelligence, studied in the royal courts and boardrooms of Europe. They spoke of mighty rivers, fertile lands, and populations ripe for control. They laid the groundwork for the men who would carry the compass and the cross, the advance scouts of empire. This initial phase of contact was a masterclass in brutal economics. It established a pattern of extraction that would define the colonial age. The wealth that flowed out of Africa did not build African cities or schools. It financed the very industrial and military might that would return to subjugate the continent. Each shipload of captives was another nail in the coffin of African independence. The groundwork was laid, the target softened, the motive established. The curtain was falling on the age of plunder by sea and rising on the age of conquest by land. The question on the lips of Europe's power brokers was no longer what they could buy from Africa, but what they could take. The great race was about to begin. The world has always been shaped by two forces: greed and good intentions, often wielded by the same people. Who do you think caused more long-term damage in Africa? The cynical slaver who saw people as cargo, or the idealistic missionary whose maps led the armies? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. The age of the explorer was an age of magnificent lies. These were not mere adventurers seeking to fill in the blank spaces on the map. They were the unrecognized vanguard of empire, spies disguised as scientists, conquistadors armed with Bibles and sextants. He walked with God, but the devil followed with a surveyor's chain. No figure embodies this paradox more than Dr. David Livingstone. A Scottish missionary, a man of genuine faith and fierce anti-slavery conviction, he plunged into the heart of southern and central Africa with a burning desire to heal, to convert, to bring Christianity, commerce, and civilization. For 30 years, he trekked thousands of miles crossing the Kalahari, tracing the Zambezi, becoming the first European to witness the thunderous majesty of the falls he named Victoria. He was a hero to the Victorian public, a symbol of British pluck and piety. But his detailed maps, his meticulous reports on navigable rivers, fertile lands, and tribal politics were not just entries in a journal. They were military-grade intelligence, pored over by industrialists and politicians in London. Livingstone was looking for souls to save. They were looking for markets to exploit and territories to claim. Every river he charted was a potential highway for gunboats. Every village he visited a future tax roll. He opened Africa to the European imagination, but also to the European army. When Livingstone vanished into the interior for years, the world held its breath. The man sent to find him was his polar opposite, the dark shadow to Livingstone's light. Henry Morton Stanley was no missionary. He was a Welsh-born American journalist, a cynical, ambitious, and utterly ruthless opportunist. His famous greeting, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," upon finding the ailing doctor in 1871, was a masterstroke of theatrical self-promotion. But Stanley's real work began after Livingstone's death. Hired by a consortium of newspapers, and later, more ominously, by a European king, Stanley returned to Africa not to save it, but to break it. His expedition to trace the full course of the Congo River from its source to the sea was an epic of survival and savagery. It was less a scientific endeavor than a military campaign. With a private army of mercenaries and porters, Stanley blasted his way through the jungle, his Maxim gun carving a path of terror. He recorded his discoveries, but his true mission was to assess the economic potential of the Congo Basin. His reports spoke of unimaginable wealth in ivory, and, most prophetically, in the wild rubber vines that choked the forests. These reports did not go to a scientific society. They went to the desk of the most ambitious monarch in Europe. While Stanley was pioneering brutality in the service of capital, another player entered the game. Pierre Savorgnan de Brazza, an Italian-born nobleman serving France, was Stanley's great rival. Where Stanley was a thug, de Brazza was a charmer. He trekked into the Congo Basin from the north, traveling light, respecting local customs, and presenting himself as a friend. He didn't use bullets, he used flags and contracts. He persuaded local chiefs along the river to sign treaties placing their lands under French protection. The chiefs, unable to read the French legal jargon, thought they were signing friendship agreements. In reality, they were signing away their sovereignty for bolts of cloth and trinkets. It was conquest by fountain pen, a quieter but no less effective form of theft. This was the explorer's gambit, a frantic race between men like Stanley and de Brazza, one carving a path with violence, the other with guile, both claiming vast swathes of land for masters thousands of miles away. Their race up and down the Congo River created a flashpoint. Who owned what? Whose fraudulent treaty trumped whose? The situation was becoming dangerously chaotic. To the great powers of Europe, this was unacceptable. The plunder of a continent needed to be orderly. It required rules, a gentleman's agreement to ensure the gentlemen did not start a war among themselves over the spoils. The call for a conference, for a moment of calm negotiation, came from the master of European realpolitik, a man who cared little for Africa, but everything for the balance of power in Europe, the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. The stage was set for the most audacious heist in history, not in a jungle or a palace, but in a quiet, wood-paneled room in the heart of a cold European winter. The scene shifts from the sweltering jungle to the frosty air of Berlin in the winter of 1884. Here, in a palace on the Wilhelmstrasse, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck convened a meeting. On the surface, its purpose was noble: to regulate trade in Africa, to ensure the welfare of native peoples, and to finally stamp out the lingering slave trade. It was a lie, of course, a beautiful, civilized, diplomatic lie. The Berlin Conference was not about saving Africa. It was about how to carve it up without the carvers cutting each other's throats. For 3 months, the delegates of 14 nations, all the great powers of Europe plus the United States of America, sat around a massive, horseshoe-shaped table. On the wall behind them hung a huge map of Africa, its interior still a vast, tempting blank. There was not a single African in the room, not one king, not one chief, not one representative of the 100 million people whose fates were being decided. It was a meeting of wolves discussing the fairest way to divide a flock of sheep, with the primary concern being that each wolf received a respectable portion. In Berlin, they divided what did not belong to them, promised what they could not give, and cursed those they had never seen. Bismarck, the honest broker, presided with cynical pragmatism. He had little interest in colonies himself, but he was a master at using the colonial ambitions of his rivals, France and Britain, to Germany's advantage. The French delegates spoke with revolutionary fervor about France's mission civilisatrice, its duty to spread enlightenment. The British delegates spoke of the white man's burden, the moral obligation to uplift the savage races. The representative of King Leopold II of Belgium spoke with unparalleled hypocrisy about creating a zone of free trade and humanitarian benevolence in the Congo. They were all actors in a grand theatre of the absurd, their high-minded rhetoric a thin veil for naked greed. The true business of the conference happened in the corridors and backrooms over cigars and brandy. The key breakthrough, the rule that unleashed the hounds, was the principle of effective occupation. It was a simple, brutal idea. Any power that could demonstrate it had a substantial presence in a coastal area had the right to claim the hinterland behind it. A flag, a fort, a handful of soldiers, that was enough. Furthermore, any new claim had to be announced to the other signatory powers. It was a starting gun. The scramble for Africa was now official policy. The conference did not partition Africa. That would happen on the ground, with rifles and machine guns. What it did was lay down the ground rules for the conquest, turning a chaotic land grab into an orderly, legally sanctioned process. It was a continental heist planned in meticulous detail. With a ruler and a pencil, they drew lines on the map. These lines, straight and indifferent, cut across ancient kingdoms, ethnic groups, migration routes, and river systems. The Congo people were sliced between the French Congo, the Belgian Congo, and Portuguese Angola. The Maasai found themselves split between British Kenya and German Tanganyika. The borders of modern Africa, those famously illogical lines that have fueled a century of conflict, were born in this room, drawn by men who saw the continent not as a home to millions, but as an empty chessboard. The greatest and most terrible creation of the conference was its treatment of the Congo. The vast basin, a territory 75 times the size of Belgium, was not granted to any nation. In a masterstroke of lobbying and deception, it was recognized as the personal property of one man, a man who had convinced the world he was a great philanthropist, a humanitarian who would pour his personal fortune into ending slavery and bringing progress to the heart of Africa. His name was King Leopold II of Belgium, and he had just been handed the keys to a private kingdom of unimaginable size and wealth, with no oversight and no accountability. The delegates congratulated themselves on a job well done. They had avoided a European war, established free trade on the Congo and Niger rivers, and committed themselves, on paper, to the well-being of the African people. Then they went home and sent out the armies. The ink was barely dry on the Berlin Act before the race began in earnest. The starting gun had been fired, and all across Africa a new wave of men arrived, not with Bibles, but with treaty forms and machine guns, ready to make the lines on the map a bloody reality. His public image was that of a kindly, bearded monarch, a constitutional king who dedicated his life to philanthropy. King Leopold II of Belgium was a master of public relations, a man who sold the world a beautiful dream. He spoke of a crusade against the Arab slave traders, of creating a haven of free trade and enlightenment in the heart of what he called the Dark Continent. He founded the International African Association, a supposedly scientific and humanitarian organization, and used it to lobby the great powers. He assured the United States of America that his Congo would be a free state, open to all, a noble experiment in upliftment. He convinced the delegates in Berlin. They granted him, not his country, personal sovereignty over the Congo Free State. It was the deadliest philanthropic project in human history. What Leopold created was not a state, but a gigantic slave plantation, a personal asset to be squeezed for maximum profit. His true goal was not to free the Congolese, but to enslave them in the pursuit of ivory, and above all, rubber. The invention of the inflatable rubber tire by John Dunlop in 1888 created a ravenous global demand for rubber. The Congo basin was choked with wild rubber vines, and Leopold held the monopoly. To extract this red rubber, as it came to be known, he unleashed a reign of terror so systematic and cruel, it remains almost unbelievable. He created a private army, the Force Publique, staffed by European mercenaries and African orphans or slaves who were trained to feel no loyalty to the local people. This army was the instrument of his greed. Villages were given impossible quotas for rubber collection. To fail was to invite a punitive expedition from the Force Publique. The punishment was death. To prove that they were not wasting bullets on hunting animals, soldiers were ordered to bring back the severed right hand of every person they killed. When quotas were not met, soldiers would often chop the hands off living men, women, and children to satisfy the accountants of the regime. Photographs from this era are a gallery of horror. Grieving fathers staring at the tiny severed hands and feet of their children, mutilated survivors holding up their stumps for the camera. This was not random cruelty. It was state policy. Entire villages were burned, populations massacred. People fled into the jungle to escape the rubber tax, only to starve to death. The birth rate plummeted. Disease, famine, and murder, all directly resulting from Leopold's system, carried off an estimated 10 million people, perhaps half the population of the Congo Free State. Leopold, sitting in his palace in Brussels, became one of the richest men in the world. The profits from blood and rubber-funded lavish public works in Belgium, parks, museums, triumphal arches, earning him the title the Builder King. It was the ultimate colonial laundering scheme, African suffering converted into European splendor. The world, for a time, was blind. Leopold's masterful propaganda machine kept the truth at bay, but whispers began to escape the rubber-choked forests. Missionaries wrote letters. Ship workers saw the grim cargo. A shipping clerk in Liverpool named Edmund Morel noticed a terrible anomaly. Ships arriving from the Congo were filled with valuable rubber and ivory, but the ships returning carried almost nothing of value, only soldiers, guns, and ammunition. There was no trade. This, he deduced, could only be a system of pure slavery. Morel quit his job and launched a one-man crusade. He was joined by Roger Casement, a British consul, who undertook a harrowing journey deep into the Congo and produced an official report that meticulously documented the atrocities. Together with writers like Mark Twain and Arthur Conan Doyle, They ignited the world's first major international human rights campaign. They used photographs, eyewitness testimony, and Morel's own tireless journalism to expose Leopold's ghost. The campaign grew, public outrage mounted, and finally the Belgian government, shamed before the world, could no longer ignore the monster they had enabled. In 1908, Leopold was forced to cede his private kingdom to the Belgian state. He died a year later, unrepentant, having burned the entire Congo Free State archive to hide the full extent of his crimes. The story of Leopold's Congo is the story of colonialism in its purest, most distilled form, a perfect marriage of sanctimonious hypocrisy and limitless greed. What drives a person to destroy millions in the name of profit? Was Leopold a uniquely monstrous individual, a devil in human form, or was he simply the most logical product of a system that valued profit above all else? Let us know what you think in the comments. While Leopold was perfecting his model of private terror in the heart of the continent, the great national empires were pursuing their own conquests with the more conventional tools of iron and blood. In West Africa, France was on the move, driven by a vision of a vast, contiguous French-African empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. Their primary instrument was the French Foreign Legion, an army of hardened mercenaries who marched under the desert sun with a simple mission: subdue and annex. Their advance from Senegal eastward was relentless. They faced not disorganized tribes, but powerful, well-structured Islamic empires. The Tukulur Empire, forged by the scholar and warrior El Hajj Umar Tal, resisted fiercely. His son and successor, Amadou Sékou, fought a long, desperate war against French encroachment. But the French had superior firepower, artillery, and repeating rifles against muskets and swords. Fort after fort fell, city after city was burned. The French campaign was a slow, grinding war of attrition that shattered the Tukulur state. Further south, the French ran into an even more formidable opponent, Samurai Touré, the founder of the Wassoulou Empire. Samurai was a military genius. He understood he could not defeat the French in a conventional battle. Instead, he waged a brilliant scorched-earth guerrilla campaign that lasted for nearly 2 decades. He had his own workshops to manufacture and repair firearms. When the French advanced, his forces would retreat, burning villages and crops, drawing the French columns deeper into hostile territory, harassing them with raids and ambushes. He forced the French to pay for every mile of ground in blood. But in the end, even Samurai's brilliance could not overcome the sheer industrial might of the French Empire. Captured in 1898, he was exiled and died, a symbol of a fierce and intelligent resistance that ultimately stood no chance. While France pushed from the west, Britain was consolidating its power along the coast and pushing inland. The British had a different style, often preferring what they called indirect rule. But when their commercial interests were threatened, their response was just as brutal as anyone's. Their primary obstacle in the Gold Coast was the powerful Ashanti Confederacy. The Ashanti were a proud, militaristic people whose kingdom was built on gold and slaves. Their capital, Kumasi, was a large, sophisticated city. Several Anglo-Ashanti wars were fought throughout the century, but the final confrontation came in 1896. A British expeditionary force armed with Maxim guns marched on Kumasi. The Ashanti, weakened by internal divisions, offered little resistance. The British burned the city to the ground, dynamited sacred sites, and sent the Ashanti king into exile. It was a calculated act of cultural destruction designed to break the spirit of the people. The most dramatic example of European technological superiority came further east in the Sudan. Here, a charismatic Islamic leader, Muhammad Ahmad, had proclaimed himself the Mahdi, the guided one, and led a massive uprising against Anglo-Egyptian rule. His followers, the Ansar, were fanatical warriors who, in 1885, had captured the city of Khartoum and killed the British general Charles Gordon. For over a decade, the Mahdist state ruled the Sudan. But Britain was determined to avenge Gordon and reconquer the territory. In 1898, a massive Anglo-Egyptian army under the command of Sir Herbert Kitchener steamed up the Nile. The decisive battle was fought at Omdurman. The Mahdist army, 50,000 strong, charged the British lines with desperate courage, armed with spears and old rifles. The British had 20 Maxim machine guns and modern artillery. It was not a battle. It was an industrial slaughter. In a few hours, 11,000 Mahdists were killed and 16,000 wounded. The British lost 47 men. One young war correspondent present that day, Winston Churchill, described it as the most signal triumph ever gained by the arms of science over barbarians. It was the logic of the entire colonial project distilled into a single bloody morning, the triumph of the machine over the man, a victory so absolute it seemed to confirm Europe's God-given right to rule. From the Sahara to the Gold Coast, from the Niger to the Nile, the story was the same: heroic, desperate, and ultimately doomed resistance against an industrial killing machine. In the southern part of the continent, the driving force of British imperialism was not just geopolitical strategy, but something far more primal: the lust for diamonds and gold. And this ambition was embodied in one towering, controversial figure, Cecil Rhodes. Rhodes was a man of staggering ambition and profound contradictions. The son of an English vicar, he arrived in South Africa for his health and ended up controlling 90% of the world's diamond production through his company, De Beers. He was a dreamer who envisioned a map of Africa painted solid British red, a continuous line of territory connected by a railway from Cape to Cairo. He was also a ruthless businessman and an unapologetic white supremacist who believed the Anglo-Saxon race was destined to rule the world. To Rhodes, politics and business were the same game. He became Prime Minister of the Cape Colony and used his political power to further his commercial interests and his commercial wealth to fund his imperial ambitions. His chosen instrument was not the British Army, but his own private enterprise, the British South Africa Company. Chartered by the British government, it was a state within a state, with the power to make treaties, raise armies, and govern territory. It was the modern incarnation of the East India Company, a corporate entity licensed to conquer. Rhodes set his sights on the lands north of the Transvaal, the territory of the Ndebele people, ruled by King Lobengula. In 1888, Rhodes's agents tricked Lobengula into signing the Rudd Concession, a document that the king believed granted only limited mining rights. In fact, its deceptive wording gave Rhodes's company complete control over his lands and mineral resources. When Lobengula realized he had been deceived, it was too late. Rhodes's pioneer column, a private army of settlers and mercenaries, marched in and occupied Mashonaland. The inevitable Ndebele uprising that followed was crushed by the company's Maxim guns. Lobengula died a fugitive, his kingdom dismantled and renamed Rhodesia in honor of the man who had stolen it. This was conquest by contract, backed by overwhelming force. But Rhodes's greatest challenge came not from African kingdoms but from other white settlers, the Boers. The Boers, descendants of Dutch farmers, had established two independent republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. They were fiercely independent, deeply religious, and sat on the richest gold discovery in human history, the Witwatersrand. Rhodes, backed by British imperial ambition, was determined to have it. His first attempt was a fiasco. In 1895, he sponsored the Jameson Raid, a clumsy and illegal attempt to trigger an uprising of British expatriates in the Transvaal. The raid failed miserably, forcing Rhodes to resign as Prime Minister and deeply embarrassing the British government. But it made war between Britain and the Boer republics inevitable. The Second Boer War, which broke out in 1899, was a brutal and protracted conflict. The Boers were skilled horsemen and marksmen, and they inflicted a series of humiliating defeats on the overconfident British army in the war's early stages. The conflict turned into a long, bitter guerrilla war. In response, the British commander, Lord Kitchener, fresh from his victory at Omdurman, implemented a scorched earth policy. Boer farms were burned, their crops destroyed, their livestock slaughtered. To house the displaced Boer women and children and to prevent them from aiding the guerrilla fighters, the British established a network of what they called concentration camps. The conditions in these camps were horrific. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate food and medical care led to rampant disease. Over 26,000 Boer women and children perished in these camps, a man-made humanitarian disaster that would forever stain Britain's reputation. The war also saw black Africans caught in the crossfire, serving on both sides and dying in camps of their own, their suffering largely unrecorded. Britain eventually won the war, annexing the Boer republics in 1902, but the victory came at a tremendous cost in lives and money, and it laid the bitter foundations for the future. The Union of British Colonies and former Boer republics in 1910 created the Union of South Africa. To appease the defeated Boers, Britain largely granted them political control, entrenching racial segregation and creating the political framework that would later give birth to the ultimate colonial legacy, the system of apartheid. Rhodes's dream of a Cape to Cairo railway was never fully realized, but his legacy of corporate conquest and racial division shaped the destiny of southern Africa for the next century. Not every imperial ambition in Africa ended in triumph. On the Horn of Africa, the ancient mountainous kingdom of Ethiopia stood as a defiant exception to the rule, a story of resistance that sent shockwaves through the colonial world. Italy, a latecomer to the imperial game, unified as a nation only in 1871, was desperate for a place in the sun. It had already seized Eritrea and parts of Somalia, and it saw the ancient Christian empire of Ethiopia as the crown jewel for its fledgling African empire. The Italians believed it would be an easy conquest. They had a modern, well-equipped army, and they were, after all, a European power facing an African one. They vastly underestimated their opponent. The Emperor of Ethiopia, Menelik II, was a brilliant statesman and a shrewd modernizer. He played European powers against each other, buying modern weapons from the French and Russians. He united Ethiopia's feuding regional lords against the common threat. When Italy tried to use a deceptively worded treaty to claim Ethiopia as a protectorate, Menelik renounced it and prepared for war. In 1896, a large Italian army, confident of a quick victory, marched deep into Ethiopian territory. Menelik had mobilized a massive, well-armed and passionately patriotic force of his own. The two armies met near the town of Adwa. The battle was a catastrophe for the Italians. Outmaneuvered, outfought and overwhelmed, the Italian army was annihilated. It was a stunning, unprecedented victory for an African nation. For the first time, a European colonial army had been decisively defeated by African forces in a major battle. The news of Adwa electrified the African diaspora around the world. It was a powerful symbol that white invincibility was a myth, that resistance was not futile. Ethiopia secured its independence, a lone beacon of freedom, along with the American-sponsored state of Liberia, on a continent submerged by colonial rule. While Ethiopia celebrated its triumph, a very different drama was playing out to its north, in the Sudan. The British, having crushed the Mahdist army at Omdurman, were engaged in the brutal and methodical pacification of the country. This was not a war of glorious battles, but a grim campaign of suppression against a defiant population. Kitchener's army moved through the country, stamping out the last embers of Mahdist resistance. The body of the Mahdi was exhumed from its tomb, his head cut off, and, according to some accounts, kept by Kitchener as a trophy. It was a policy of absolute subjugation, designed not just to conquer, but to humiliate. The war in the desert was a testament to the cold, calculating fury of an empire scorned. Unlike the sharp, decisive clash at Adwa, the reconquest of Sudan was a long, grinding process of executions, punitive raids, and the imposition of a rigid colonial bureaucracy. The two stories, unfolding side by side, offer a stark contrast. Ethiopia's victory was a triumph of national unity, shrewd leadership, and the will to fight for freedom on one's own terms. It proved that an African nation could, under the right circumstances, defeat a European power. The British campaign in Sudan was a demonstration of imperial retribution. It showed that once the full weight of an industrial empire was brought to bear, resistance, no matter how fervent, would be systematically and ruthlessly crushed. The Horn of Africa became a microcosm of the continent's fate, a place of both spectacular triumph and profound tragedy, a testament to both the enduring spirit of independence and the unforgiving logic of imperial power. What ultimately secures freedom, the cunning diplomacy of a leader like Menelik II, or the unyielding force of armed rebellion against an occupier? Share your choice below. Germany joined the scramble for Africa late, but it did so with a chilling ferocity. Unified and ambitious under Bismarck, Germany was determined to claim its own Platz an der Sonne, its place in the sun. The colonies it carved out in Togo, Cameroon, German East Africa, and most infamously, German Southwest Africa, were run with a rigid, militaristic efficiency that quickly descended into unimaginable brutality. The story of German colonialism is short, but it is a case study in extremism, culminating in the first genocide of the 20th century. In German Southwest Africa, today's Namibia, German settlers began appropriating the best land and cattle from the indigenous Herero people. Tensions exploded in 1904 when the Herero rose up in a desperate rebellion against colonial abuses. The German response was not merely to suppress the revolt, but to exterminate the entire people. The command was given to General Lothar von Trotha, a man who brought with him a doctrine of absolute terror. After defeating the Herero warriors at the Battle of Waterberg, von Trotha issued his infamous Vernichtungsbefehl, or annihilation order. It stated that every Herero male, armed or unarmed, was to be shot. Women and children were to be driven into the desert. This was not a military order, it was a death sentence for a nation. The German soldiers systematically sealed off the Omaheke Desert, poisoning the few waterholes. The Herero people, trapped between German guns and the unforgiving sands, died by the thousands from thirst and starvation. When the Nama people rose up in the south, they were met with the same genocidal policy. Survivors from both groups were rounded up and herded into concentration camps, where they perished from forced labor, malnutrition, and disease. By the time the campaign was over, an estimated 80% of the Herero population and 50% of the Nama population were dead. It was a calculated, bureaucratic genocide, a dress rehearsal for horrors that would later unfold in Europe. The German command kept meticulous records of the extermination, a chilling preview of the industrialization of death. In German East Africa, another rebellion was met with a different but equally devastating form of cruelty. The Maji Maji Rebellion, which broke out in 1905, was a mass uprising by numerous ethnic groups united by a spiritual belief in a magic water, or Magi, that they believed would turn German bullets into water. The initial attacks had some success, but the German military response was swift and merciless. When conventional fighting failed to crush the widespread guerrilla war, the German governor implemented a policy of systematic famine. Colonial troops swept through the region, destroying villages, burning crops, and confiscating food stores. The goal was to starve the population into submission. The rebellion was broken not by bullets, but by hunger. An estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Africans died, the vast majority of them civilians who starved to death as a direct result of German policy. This was exemplary cruelty. It was a message sent to any who might dare to resist German order. The German colonial project was built on a foundation of racial arrogance and the absolute belief in the right of the stronger to eliminate the weaker. While other colonial powers were certainly guilty of horrific atrocities, the German approach in Southwest Africa and East Africa was notable for its systematic, intentional, and ideologically driven nature. It was not just about exploitation or suppression, it was, in the case of the Herero and Nama, about erasure. The brief and brutal chapter of German colonialism in Africa stands as a dark harbinger, a demonstration of how the logic of racial supremacy, when combined with industrial efficiency and military power, could lead directly to genocide. The sun had indeed risen on Germany's empire, but it cast a long and blood-red shadow. Once the thunder of the Maxim guns faded and the initial violent phase of conquest was complete, a new challenge arose for the European powers: how to govern these vast new territories. The goal was simple: to rule millions of people with a minimum of European personnel and expense, all while ensuring a steady, profitable flow of resources back to the metropole. The solution was the creation of the colonial state, a machine of administration designed for one purpose: efficient exploitation. Infrastructure was the skeleton of this machine. Railways were built, but they were not designed to connect African cities or facilitate internal trade. They ran from the mineral-rich or plantation-filled interior directly to the coast, creating a network of steel funnels designed to siphon wealth out of the continent. The line from the copper mines of Katanga to the sea, the line from the cotton fields of Uganda to Mombasa, these were not arteries of development, but veins for extraction. To make this system profitable, Africans had to be forced into the colonial economy. The most effective tool was taxation. Colonial governments imposed hut taxes or poll taxes, payable only in the colonial currency. Since most Africans lived in a subsistence economy with little use for cash, the only way to pay the tax was to work for a European employer, on a plantation, in a mine, or as a porter for the colonial administration. This single policy shattered traditional ways of life, forcing men to leave their villages and families for long periods to become a cheap, mobile labor force. Failure to pay the tax was met with brutal punishment, flogging, imprisonment, or having one's hut burned down. It was a simple and brutally effective way to create a proletariat overnight. To police these vast territories, the colonizers created colonial armies. The French had their tirailleurs sénégalais, the British their King's African Rifles, the Germans their askari. These troops were composed of African soldiers led by white European officers. They were often deliberately recruited from ethnic groups perceived as more martial, or from outside the regions they were tasked with policing. This was a core tenet of the colonial state: divide and conquer. Africans were used to suppress other Africans, creating and exacerbating ethnic tensions that would explode into violence decades later. The governing philosophies of the colonial powers varied in style, but not in substance. The French pursued a policy of assimilation. In theory, an African could, by adopting French language, culture, and education, become a French citizen. In practice, this status was granted to a minuscule elite, creating a small class of collaborators, while the vast majority remained disenfranchised subjects. The British, in contrast, preferred indirect rule. They sought to govern through existing traditional rulers, chiefs, and emirs. This seemed more enlightened, preserving local institutions. But it was a facade. The British chose which chiefs to recognize, often empowering individuals who would have held little authority in the pre-colonial system. These puppet rulers were given power and wealth as long as they enforced British policy, collected taxes, and provided labor. This policy often distorted or corrupted traditional power structures, creating new hierarchies and resentments. Whether through direct assimilation or indirect rule, the result was the same: the imposition of an absolute autocratic government where Africans had no voice. A district commissioner, often a young man in his 20s, fresh from Europe, held the power of life and death over hundreds of thousands of people. The colonial state was a machine of control, held together by a network of roads, taxes, and, ultimately, bayonets. It was a system of latent violence, where every administrative act was backed by the implicit threat of overwhelming force. It stripped Africans of their sovereignty, their economic independence, and their political agency, slowly suffocating traditional societies and reshaping the continent in the image of its European masters. The machine was in place, running efficiently, and its gears ground on, producing wealth for Europe and misery for Africa. By 1914, the scramble was over. The Great Feast had concluded, and the map of Africa was a patchwork of European colors. From a continent of 1,000 kingdoms and polities, only 2 nations remained independent: the ancient empire of Ethiopia, which had defended its freedom with blood, and the small state of Liberia, settled by freed American slaves and protected by the interests of the United States of America. The rest belonged to Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, and Spain. The European powers, having gorged themselves on Africa, now turned their industrialized killing machines on each other. The Great War, what we now call World War I, was not just a European conflict, it was a world war, and Africa became another one of its battlefields. The German colonies were invaded by Allied forces. Hundreds of thousands of African soldiers, tirailleurs, askaris, porters, were conscripted to fight and die for their colonial masters, both in Africa and in the muddy trenches of Europe. They fought for empires that had stolen their land and denied them their freedom, a bitter irony lost on few. The war shattered the myth of European unity and civilization. For African soldiers who witnessed the senseless slaughter in Europe, it was a profound revelation. The white man, who claimed to be a superior being, was just as capable of savagery as anyone else, if not more so. This experience, combined with the promises of self-determination made by Allied leaders like Woodrow Wilson, helped to plant the seeds of modern African nationalism. The war ended, but the colonial map remained. The lines drawn in Berlin, once abstract marks on paper, had now hardened into militarized borders, patrolled by customs officials and police. These artificial frontiers became the permanent scars of the partition, the primary source of the continent's future instability. Peoples with a shared history were divided, while rival groups were forced together into new, artificial entities called colonies. The modern African state was not born from a shared culture or history, but from the administrative convenience of a colonial power. This is perhaps the most enduring and destructive legacy of the Scramble. The economic legacy was just as crippling. By the end of the colonial era, African economies were not designed for self-sufficiency, but for export. They were structured to produce one or two raw materials, cocoa in Ghana, copper in Zambia, cotton in Sudan, for a global market whose prices they did not control. This created a permanent dependency, a neo-colonial relationship that would persist long after the European flags were lowered. The psychological legacy runs deepest of all. Decades of being told you are inferior, of having your culture denigrated, your history erased, and your destiny controlled by others, leaves a profound trauma. The struggle for independence in the 20th century would be not just a political and military battle, but a struggle to reclaim a sense of identity, pride, and agency. The scramble for Africa did not end when the guns fell silent. Its consequences echo through every coup, every civil war, every border dispute, and every economic crisis on the continent today. It was an act of breathtaking arrogance and greed, a historical crime on a continental scale. The men who gathered in Berlin thought they were shaping the future for their own benefit, but in drawing lines on a map, they sowed the seeds of 100 future conflicts and created a world whose instability continues to haunt us all. The great colonial machine had done its work, but in doing so it had set in motion forces of resistance and change that would, in time, tear the machine apart. The struggle for Africa's soul was only just beginning. The lines drawn on the map in Berlin turned into real borders that divided peoples and laid the foundation for future conflicts. Today, the world once again faces the choice of how to draw borders: political, cultural, digital. Tell us, what do you think is more important for the future, the inviolability of established borders or the right of peoples to self-determination, even if it leads to chaos? Write your answer in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us.